Welcome to Corwin's Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast with host Peter DeWitt. This podcast is from education leaders for education leaders. Every week, Peter and our guests get together to share ideas, put research into practice, and ensure every student is learning, not by chance, but by design.
Hi, Ariel. How are you?
Hey, Peter. Doing pretty well. Another glorious Monday.
Another glorious Monday. I love that we kick these off on Mondays.
Me too.
That's really good. It's such a great way for me to get inspired during the week. And honestly, So Julie Stern is our guest obviously today, and she's talking about learning the transfers. But we got into so many different topics. Now, what people hear is Julie is somebody that I admire very much. And when I read her Conceptual Understanding book, I remember just sitting there taking notes. And I've got it over in my library, and I just wrote notes. And she is so amazing to talk to, because I swear, even my questions don't have to be coherent, and she can make them sound coherent and give such great answers.
She is something pretty special as an editor. She is one of my favorite success stories, because I remember she proposed a book about social studies to me many years ago, and I loved it so much. And at the time we weren't publishing anything in social studies, but I convinced her to kind of take it in a different direction. And we ended up having the tools for teaching conceptual understanding books. There's one for elementary and secondary. And then that led to finally a social studies book, The Visible Learning for Social Studies, which she co-authored with John Hattie and Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry. And now she's got this new Learning That Transfers book coming out, or actually it just came out. And that's, all of her books have become bestsellers, and they're fantastic. So it makes me really, really happy to hear her talk about, all that she's got going on now. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, there's some key things that I want people to listen for. I asked specifically at the beginning, what is learning the transfers? What does that mean? And then she is able to give such a descriptive and yet simple to understand idea behind it. And I joke, but honestly, I feel like I could throw any topic to her and she just starts running. And she talks a little bit about her children, who I'm a little intimidated by with how smart they sound, but also just the fact that she's so easily accessible with where she has this work. She's got a great, besides the book, she's got the Thinkific platform where she offers these courses up so people, no matter where they are in the world, can take these courses and learn from them as well. So,
yep.
What about you? What did you appreciate that she said that people can hear for and listen for when they
Yeah. Well, I just love that this episode is probably the closest to the classroom that we've done so far in the series. And I shouldn't say classroom, I should say it's the closest to the process of teaching and learning, I think, that we've discussed so far in this season. And, she does talk quite a bit about kind of adapting lessons for online teaching if you're virtual or going back in person, whatever the case may be. But I love that she goes so deep, and she clearly is such an expert in just how we learn as teachers and as students. And she can speak to that at that level just with so much depth and cohesion. I love it.
Well, this is on Learning the Transfers. Julie Stern is the guest, and I'm looking forward to hearing from people about what they take away from this podcast episode as well.
All right, let's listen in.
Julie Stern, welcome to the Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast. Thanks for being here.
Definitely. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, I think you know that you're one of my favorite people. I mean, ever since I was reading your book on conceptual understanding, I started stalking you, right? So I started reading out to you and all that stuff, just saying I was a big fan. So your work is really amazing. You have a new book out called Learning the Transfers, and John Hattie wrote the foreword. And what is When you write about learning the transfers, what do you mean here? What is learning the transfers, and why is it so important to how we should approach teaching and learning?
Yeah, great question. What do we even mean by this? Learning that transfers. I felt like years ago I had to sort of define learning transfer everywhere that I went, but it seems like it's getting more into the water, and people can infer if they've never heard of it before, but it's simply applying learning from one situation to another. And there's a spectrum. I think that's the big thing that I try to make sure teachers understand, that even standardized tests, most assessments, those are what I would call simple transfer or similar transfer, where students are applying their learning to at least somewhat of a different, like if the question is worded differently, then one would say that this is a bit more than recall. So it's basically anything beyond recall is transfer. Can students see a new situation and can they apply their learning? And so that's what my new passion is all about. Of course, conceptual understanding and conceptual organization is what facilitates transfer. But that's where we are in place and time in the course of human history, that learning to remember is not enough. We need students to be able to see a new situation and apply their learning, whether or not that situation is very similar to where they've learned it or radically different. The goal remains the same in that students can apply their learning to new situations.
During COVID, everybody talks a lot about COVID learning loss, and I've had the opportunity to talk to lots of researchers who have said, stop calling it COVID learning loss. We've never been through a pandemic. Kids are where they are. We have to figure out where they are and then move on from there. One of the things that I think is an even bigger issue, or at least equally as huge of an issue, is that we had a lot of students home doing remote learning, and what we found is that they didn't know what to do when they didn't know what to do. So they were sitting alone at their house. They didn't have an adult hovering around them to help them. I even remember watching the Today Show one morning, and this was a topic of the conversation with one of their commentators, and they were talking about how students are struggling and they don't know what to do at home when they're trying to get through their assignments. And one of the anchors asked, so what should be the first step? Should they hire a tutor if they can? And the commentator said, no, they should contact the teacher right away. And I thought, I don't know if that's necessarily the first step. And I feel like that, and I thought of your work actually when I was watching this, because it's the idea that when students are at home and they don't know what to do at this time during COVID, learning the transfer is actually a really powerful way to be able to focus on that, right? Because it's about getting an understanding of where you are and then trying to figure out the resources on your own and where to go. Would that be a part of it?
Absolutely. The ultimate goal is student independence. And so teaching them explicitly how to attack a problem, when they don't know what to do, knowing sort of how to figure out what to do is really the goal. And in writing the book, Visible Learning for Social Studies with John Hattie, Doug Fisher, and Nancy Fry, looking at that triangle of surface, deep, and transfer, we talk about in those books, the Visible Learning Practice Series, how the role of metacognition and the role of independence increases from surface to deep to transfer. And so you're spot on. I think there's so many reasons why I don't like the term learning loss, because kids are learning something. Whether or not it's what we want them to be learning is a question. But I have two kids. They have learned a ton in the last year, including things that maybe are not in the quote unquote standards, but many things that are. For instance, they're doing skip counting. They're 5 and 6. And I told them, look, you can, while I'm doing my work, I let them binge watch Netflix or something like that. And so I say to them, look, every time it auto plays a show, you got to run around the couch 20 times. And it's hysterical. They do it. I can hear them from my office going 1, 2, running around the couch. And so now they're skip counting. They're like, okay, we want to watch 5 episodes. So we need to run 100 times. I'm just like, boom, they can figure it out. Or like I set limits on their iPad for how long they can watch it. And they can add very, complex 60 minutes is an hour. Like they're doing this complex, they're making equations basically of like how many hours they could watch if they watch it together. And it's it's really interesting to see what they're learning. And so ultimately, yeah, we have to figure out ways for our young people to say, here's my goal. And then how can I almost sort of backwards plan from that to reach that goal? And one of the things that is a big sort of emphasis of our new book is building a culture of transfer. And so we want students to look at a situation and ask themselves, how does my prior knowledge apply in this situation? And that's at first hard. And it's hard for teachers. And so one of the first things we do in our professional learning is training teachers how to do that, training teachers to look at a situation and figure out how their prior knowledge might unlock this new situation. So all of my workshops, I start with something that I'm hoping the teachers have never heard of. And I'm like, here's this news story. Here's this video about architecture in Bolivia. Here's, something that you've never seen before. How can you use your prior knowledge to access this situation? And they immediately see it's through concepts. Concepts are these more abstract ideas. When we look past the surface features of a situation and we look for these organizing transferable ideas, we can link our prior knowledge to new situations. So first step is making sure teachers can do that and then teaching that explicitly to students.
But it sounds like even when you're talking about your two sons, it's about the idea that you are respecting what it is they want to be able to do too. So there's a mutual respect there, right? There's reciprocal learning that's happening. Like they want to do this, so I'm going to have them do this. And I think that's the part that you're figuring out. Like how can I embed the teaching into something that they want to be able to do? And I think that takes a lot of deep understanding too, to understand that piece. What is it? Because when I remember I wrote a blog last year based on surveys that I did of students, and it was, this is what students want us to know about pandemic teaching and learning, posted it on LinkedIn. And I remember some people said, wow, we've read so much about what teachers want to be able to do during the pandemic, but not students. And it became this really interesting conversation about, do we respect what students want to learn? So you're right. When we talk about things like COVID learning loss, is that dependent on what the teacher was supposed to be teaching, what the school values, or does that also depend on maybe what the students might value too at home? And do we value the same thing? And I think that's why I liked your story about Netflix and binge watching and running around the couch and all that stuff. I'm glad I don't live in the floor below you. That's the other thing I kept thinking. When we're looking at things like conceptual understanding, though, and the whole idea of learning the transfers, this is, to me, I started thinking about the idea of the equity behind it all. Like, this is not something that, hey, Julie Stern's got 2 kids, and we know she's an expert when it comes to learning the transfers. So it must be all these kids who are well educated and all that stuff. They're the ones who are going to benefit from this. The whole idea of learning the transfers is also this fact that this is something all students can do. And in fact, when we have a deficit mindset and think, oh, can all populations do it? One of the populations that we also have to look at, can they benefit from this, is that of, students who actually excel at school. You were talking about standardized testing and testing. Many times that's been the mark of achievement for students, but learning to transfer or understanding how to transfer learning isn't necessarily a capability of those students just because they happen to achieve well on a test, right? Like it's a different way to set your mind. Does that question make sense when I'm asking it that way?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we're really, really excited about the possibilities for equity. So my co-authors and I, if you think about the idea of concepts or the link between our prior knowledge and new situations, then teachers can open up this whole new world of how to harness students' prior knowledge. And so, for instance, kids who maybe live in neighborhoods where there's a lot of gang activity. And I got to teach them about World War II. So, okay, that has nothing to do with their lives, like what exactly, happened in World War II. However, they understand conflict, they understand alliances, they understand allegiance and loyalty to the point of violence. They understand those things. And so really thinking through, okay, what is it that I need to teach my students? And then once I do that first step, which is what's at the core of that. So the core of World War II is conflict, allegiance, alliances. And then I can start to understand how can I link those things to students' prior knowledge? So of course, it's super simple for literature teachers. If you're thinking about the story To Kill a Mockingbird, for instance, sometimes, I was in fight with teachers sometimes who are like, I have to teach To Kill a Mockingbird. I'm like, okay, what's at the core of To Kill a Mockingbird? And students have lived experiences that they can access for that. But of course, it applies for mathematics, like the example I just gave, and science and the arts. We can think about what our students' lived experiences and how can we harness that to teach the content that we want them to understand. And so sort of our little 3-step model that we're playing with is start with their lived experiences, then teach them the concepts in the content that you feel, or the government, the standards tell you have to teach, and then transfer that to real world scenarios. And ultimately they can be whatever the students want to explore, as long as the concepts are the through line throughout. And so when you asked the question too about, or you mentioned about following students' interests, I remember that makes sense, right? And I remember my somewhat simplistic understanding of that felt overwhelming. Like, how in the world, if I've got a bunch of kids, if I'm an elementary teacher, I have like 30 kids in my class, would I think about the interest of all my students? But now my understanding is once I've got the concepts of what I want my students to understand, then they can take it to their interest and figure out, when I teach them explicitly how to go about sort of an independence in their learning, then they can take it. It's a lot less work for me. And it's incredible now what I've been able to sort of figure out with my own kids. For instance, my youngest, he's only in pre-K. Well, he's not technically in any school right now, let's be honest, but he should be in pre-kindergarten. And he's known the letter sounds, he's known numbers, counting, adding, he's known a lot of these things for a long time. So I'm not worried about him going to kindergarten. The only thing is his fine motor skills. This is a kid who was speaking in multiple languages in full paragraphs before he could walk. So like motor skills are just not his thing, or he's just late in these things. So I couldn't get him to, like, I bought like a Paw Patrol book to get him to trace. And he's like, no, I don't want to do this. Well, my kids get into Minecraft, which my husband and I are both a little bit disturbed, because like the addiction happens really fast of like how they get into these games. But now he takes blank books and he takes a crayon and he draws an entire story of Minecraft in his book, and he writes words. He's 5. He just turned 5. They're totally misspelled, but he sounds them out and he writes letters and words. And I'm just like, I couldn't get him to do it. But now that I see, he's got something and some passion for himself, I can't get him to stop. All he wants to is more blank. He's like, Mommy, more blank notebooks. So I can draw my Minecraft stories in the notebooks. And so I feel like we're really on to something, thinking about how we help teachers harness students' prior knowledge and their lived experiences, harness their interest, and achieve the things that we all want to achieve.
Yeah, I think I said this to you before. I was retained in elementary school. I barely graduated from high school. The whole idea of remembering facts, all of those kind of things, just was never my strong suit. So the reason why I just absolutely fell in love with your book when I was reading the one on conceptual understanding is just that I felt like it spoke to me. I kept thinking, wow, I wish I had this, right? Because conceptually, I like how things are connected. That's something that I think is very important. How have you been able to approach this work during a time of COVID? You and I work with a lot of schools around the world. You've got elementary school students that might be hybrid, You've got high school students that might be remote in certain places still. How do you teach this whole idea of learning the transfers in a time when people seemingly will look at remote and say, oh, you can't do it. You've got to be in person to be able to do this. But that's not true, is it? How do you do this work now and have been able to do this work over the past year during our time of COVID?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing that we did last year at this time was, convert some of our favorite strategies into digital tools. So that was the very first thing that we did. So on our website, edtosavetheworld.com, you can we have a companion website called learningthattransfers.com. All of them speak to each other, so you can go to either one of those, but tons of free resources on both of those for digital learning. So, essentially we love sticky notes. We love to get students to write concepts on sticky notes and arrange them in some way. So of course you can use Jamboard for that. You can use Google Draw, things like that. So the first thing we did was convert sort of a lot of our favorite strategies to digital tools. But the other thing that we've been really having success with, especially in this virtual environment, especially with secondary students, is harnessing their lived experiences, because they don't want to be on Zoom. They're over it. They're done with the masks and the distancing, and they can't do group work like they used to do group work, even if they are in person. A lot of those things are more difficult. And so teachers have found recently in thinking about, okay, how can I tap into students' lived experiences and connect that to the content? Students want to talk about themselves. They want to talk about things in their lives that can be related to classroom content. And so another quick example, just because I'm working with the school every week for social studies, there were having students look at, speaking of World War II, they were thinking about nationalism and fascism. And they said, what's at the core of nationalism is pride. So they opened up by saying, on like a pear deck, when is a time that you felt proud? And they just said the participation skyrocketed from the students, because that's an interesting question. They want to share, when have they felt proud? And so, linking that to the concept of nationalism and even fear, they were studying Japanese internment during World War II and why the United States did that. And so it was really cool to see the students first talking about fear. What is the role of fear in some of these decisions that the government has made in the past? And then they had to write these empathy letters as if they were Japanese Americans living in these internment camps. And so it was really amazing to see the students sort of taking on the role of these Japanese Americans internment, but also empathy for the US government. In these papers, they were like, fear has led the US government to pass this order. It was so interesting to see these connections that they were making. And so that's one of the things that I love to ask teachers to do. If you're struggling with participation, thinking about students' lived experiences is excellent way to get them to participate. The other thing that I'm playing with too is analogical reasoning. And so this is maybe listeners might not be ready for this craziness that I'm going, but I know you will be for sure, is the idea that if concepts are the connections between our prior knowledge and new experiences, when we think in analogies, when we think in comparison, we're always going through concepts. And one of the examples that I love to use, again, with my kid in the driveway, he's hula hooping and he says, "Mommy, the moon is like the Earth's hula hoop because it orbits." And I was like, hot dog, that's amazing. But what he's doing is he's thinking, okay, the hula hoop is orbiting around me. The moon orbits around the Earth. I'm going to connect this hula hoop to the moon. And so the other thing we've been playing with is these complex analogies and I share that example because he was 4 at the time when he shared this with me. To get us to see that all kids can do this. And so helping our young people think about analogies and thinking about creative materials and how materials, I'm planning this collaboration with a couple other people who've been playing with loose parts and materials a lot longer than I have. But we're working to build out this series of workshops where we were inspired actually by a tweet. Someone tweeted the periodic table of elements. and they had like phosphorus is green, and they had like a green cotton ball or something. This is flammable, and I think that was the cotton ball. And so they just started using loose parts to help them remember the elements in the periodic table of elements. And so this is when we think about materials for even secondary students and how we can build creativity into conceptual understanding that transfers, and having students think about analogies, think about materials, think about different ways they can communicate their learning. It's still very intellectually rigorous, and it's really hands-on and fun. And so that's been another fun thing that we've been playing with in this crazy environment. I'll say to students, sometimes I'll go in, I'll do like demo lessons and things like that with students. So I'll say like, look around your desk or wherever you are, or look around the room you're in right now. Can you find something that illustrates the concept we're talking about? And the kids can find something. So maybe you have some kids who are like, I have no idea what this lady's talking about. So you can sort of model it, and you'll get one kid who turns on their camera and is like, I have this glass of water. And that relates to survival. We've been talking about survival of living things, and I've got this water that connects to it. And you have kids who turn on their cameras and are like, I want to share. And so it's just, I push teachers to think, how can kids use the materials that they have at home, if they're at home, or how can they use creative materials in the classroom, if they're in the classroom, to illustrate their thinking about the course content. And that's been really, really fun.
I two things. Number one, I worry I'm not smart enough to have dinner with your children. I can see that I'm going to have to brush up on my studying if I ever get invited. But number two, why do you think people think this is so hard to teach? Because I feel like people think this is too hard to teach. It's so much easier to maybe open a textbook, or hey, I've got to follow the standards, or I don't have time to do this. Why do you think people think this is so hard to do?
Oh, that's such a good question. I mean, I think people who love learning tend to be people who go into education. And I think, teachers are exhausted. And so that's one of the other things I'm really, really focused on is, how do I not be yet another voice in the Twitter sphere, in the podcast area, who's asking teachers to do more? And so I think rightly so, there's that element is enormous. I think that public policy, we'd have to start talking about that, needs to invest in educators in a much better way. I wish if I could wave a magic wand, we would all say, okay, look, let's just give kids more recess and more passion project time, and therefore teachers have more planning time. Like right now, we could do that right now. And everybody would benefit. I think that sort of the idea that's getting challenged now, and it's not like this was necessarily terrible, but when I first started in the education field, the concept of rigor, the word rigor, I love you always talk about the words we use. Do we all agree on the definitions of the words that we use? And so I think rigor meant more content. So especially for social studies teachers, there's been Robert Marzano, Michael Flynn, Larry Ainsworth, they've done the research into how many content standards there are. And, this is getting better, but we're still not where we need to be of the number of content standards that we put on teachers' plates to say, you've got to teach this to kids. And so, there was an average, I remember in the late 90s, Marzano's research, I want to say, said that we would have to add some crazy number of additional instructional hours in order to do justice to the number of standards that are there. And so that's where you got prioritizing standards. And so anyway, one of my teammates is still a classroom teacher, one of my co-authors, Trevor Alio, and he says, oh my gosh, the number of hours that we spend deconstructing standards, unpacking standards, analyzing standards, he's just like, it's incredible amount of hours. And so I just feel like one of the reasons is it's hard to accomplish all the things that we are telling teachers they need to accomplish. And the one of the things that we say in Tools for Teaching Conceptual Understanding, when we're talking about the balance between memorization and deeper thinking, is just because you said it out loud to your students doesn't mean they learned it. That's been like really hard for me, even as a consultant, right? I'm sure for you doing teacher training, you can say something exactly in your workshop, like, please don't take this visual to mean you have to fill this out. Everybody repeat after me. Please don't take this visual to mean you have to fill it out. And then teachers are like, you'll turn around and you look at a table and teachers are like trying to fill out the visual. I'm like, I just said that. And so we know that just because we say it doesn't mean the learner learned it. However, I feel like the number of standards out there sometimes makes teachers nervous about spending too much time on the thinking and things like that. And so what I say to them is, okay, then kids are going to forget. Right. And so, one of the things that teachers tell me is, I can't believe how long my kids retain this information when we teach this way. And so it might feel like an initial investment up front, but it pays off that the kids stop forgetting what it was that we taught them. And so that's kind of why lately, to go a long way of answering your question about why do people feel like this is so hard, is I've been trying to make it more fun and playful, and let teachers see, just try it, just try a concept attainment, and see what happens. And really, this is a lot that I learned from you. So it's almost embarrassing to hear you say that you're a fan of mine, because it was always the other way around for a long time as I was coming into this field. One thing I learned from you for sure is celebrating those small wins in building collective efficacy, and really making sure that teachers feel like, okay, I was successful at this crazy thing Julie Stern is talking about with transfer. I went into the classroom and I tried a strategy and it worked. And so that's really where I start, is just try it. So, I'll sort of say, here's concept attainment. Instead of telling the students, this is the definition of a word, or this is what this thing is. That's how we normally would. We'd tell students. Flip it and see if you can give them examples and non-examples of whatever it is you're trying to teach, and ask them what they notice. And so I had this instructional coach for a school district in Georgia said, oh, Julie, I got to tell you this story. I was working with a kindergarten teacher and she was about to teach, what are the characteristics of mammals? And so we just said, okay, like, what would Julie Stern say here? So we put all the storybooks, all the books that we had in the classroom about mammals on one table, and all the animals that weren't mammals on another table. And we just asked them, this is pre-COVID, when they could all gather around multiple tables and flip through books. What do they notice? And what do you see? The 5-year-olds say, you know what we're noticing? All of these animals, they have fur. They have a baby that comes directly from their body. They don't lay eggs. Like, they're just naming all the characteristics of mammals. And, of course, the teacher and the instructional coach were like, this is amazing. And versus if I would have told them the characteristics of mammals, which one are they going to remember longer? And which one are they going to go out into their backyard and see a squirrel and think mammal? And so that's what transfer is that when they think about what are the characteristics, they can recognize it in their world.
I think it's also one of the things that I think about when you're talking to is the appreciation on the part of school principals to be able to have these conversations, to be able to focus on this within their faculty meetings, to be able to talk about teachers and be curious about what's going on in the classroom, so that teachers then feel supported when they're trying to do the same thing, right? Because when I hear things about pacing, pacing is one of those words too that can be pros and cons. Like, we understand there is a certain level of pacing that needs to happen, but sometimes people pace so much that it's kind of like instructional coaches become compliance officers. So it's about having that curiosity and that support, intersecting too with school principals and teachers. Before we go, I want to, you were very inspirational to me because you started creating courses through Thinkific, which I thought was really great. I ended up creating 2 of my own based on what I saw you doing. So it's a really great way for people to interact with you and your team and to learn all about this information. So besides buying the book, learning the transfers, and, for all their million friends, one of the ways they can directly interact with you and your team is through this whole idea of Thinkific and the courses you've created. Could you talk a couple of minutes about the courses you just created in the past, I don't know, 6 months or maybe even less than that?
Yes, we launched our first course in August, and it was really just kind of fun and to try out some of our ideas in our book that just published before it came out. And this has grown to a community of over 1,000 people, and probably about 7 courses so far. We've got, I have an incredible extended team, and we all work way too much. But we've developed level 1, level 2, and level 3 level courses. So for people who have never heard of this before, we've got these entry-level courses that are really cheap. One is $15 and the other one is, I think, $50. And those are really just what is learning that transfers. And there's one called Future of Learning. There's another one that's free that's called Goodbye Overwhelm. So back to our point about how do we sort of get teachers to a space where they can be in a learning stance. And so then level 2 are discipline-specific courses. So there's mathematics learning that transfers, social studies learning that transfers, all these different courses. And then level 3, there's a course on assessments. There's a course for leaders, and there'll be some additional courses that will roll out through the end of this year. So that's also called learningthattransfers.thinkific.com is where you find that one. However, if you find me anywhere, you can see all of our courses, because that's the way we feed our kids is through these online courses. And so you anywhere you find me, I'm sure you'll see access to our online courses.
Julie Stern, thank you for being on the Coaching Leaders podcast. It is always, I love talking to you, because it's just, I love that I can ask you a question and you just go. You just go with it. It doesn't matter. It's almost fun sometimes. What if I throw out this? And let's see where Julie's going to go. Where Julie's going to go with this. But thank you for being a part of the podcast and the work that you do. The new book is Learning the Transfers. And then check out her Thinkific courses, because they're really definitely amazing and can be very, very impactful as well. So thank you for being on the podcast.
Awesome. Thank you, Peter. I really appreciate it.
So did I hold my own there, Ariel, with Julie Stern?
I think so. And that's hard to do. So well done.
She just cracks me up, because I love her blend of, when she's talking about her 2 children, mm-hmm. and she just tells them to run around the couch.
Yeah.
Netflix, but also the learning that they're doing at the same place. But at the beginning of this, in the introduction, you had mentioned that Julie had, out of all the episodes we've done so far, closest to the classroom. And I think you're right. I think that, depending on who we're speaking to, there's going to be a difference in the elevation that they can speak to.
Yes.
Julie can talk about in the classroom, any content area. And it's almost like what I really enjoy about the conversations is that when she is answering the question, I can see she's already thinking about where to expand that into. So not only is she, is she an expert on learning the transfers and writing about it and teaching about it, but she practices what she preaches. And I appreciate that a great deal.
Yeah, I agree. I love that, she talks about how learning to teach conceptually is a process, and it can be intimidating for people to begin with, but it's so worth it, because teaching is a time-consuming process anyway. But learning to teach in this way, teaching for transfer, it ultimately maximizes our thinking and learning. And she talks about how it helps kids remember. And that's what, when I first read Julie's work, it was, like you said, kind of this like aha moment of like, oh my gosh, why isn't everything done this way? It's just the light bulbs start going off. So I hope that listeners have also had kind of similar light bulbs, or that if you're intrigued and want to learn more, you'll go and read Julie's books or listen to her podcast. Her podcast is called Conceptually Speaking. And I hope that everyone enjoys. If you like this episode, please leave us a review or listen on Apple, Spotify, or Google, or watch us on YouTube.
Yeah, before we go, her work actually makes me think that she helps elevate the profession.
Yes.
That's what I think is so great about it. It just elevates the profession. So I hope everybody enjoyed it. And like Ariel said, please make sure you give us a review and let us know what you think. And thank you for listening to Leaders Coaching Leaders with Julie Stern today.
That's right. Thanks, Peter.
All right, Ariel. See you soon.